Welcome, everybody. I think people are coming in. We have about 60 seconds until we begin this event. So thank you for waiting. "30 seconds to the beginning. All right, everybody, welcome to this event in the mid-afternoon of the midweek. My name is Tuan Huang. I am Associate Professor of Great Books here at Pepperdine University. I actually am a historian by training, and my research is in history as well. So it is truly a delight, for me to participate in this event today. For a start, I wish to thank the libraries for organizing this talk. Today's lecture is open to a general audience, and we are delighted to build community and foster understanding through events like the one that we are having right now. And then finally, I want to make an announcement that after the lecture, there will be a Q&A session. So please feel free to post your question in the chat box anytime. And we will definitely do our best to address all of them. And also be sure to stay to the end, because we will be sharing a link for you to sign up for your chance to win one of 2 autographed copies of the book by the author himself. All right, so don't leave too early. Wait until the end. All right, with that out of the way, allow me to introduce today's speaker. Lon Kurashige is Professor of History and Spatial Sciences at the University of Southern California, just down the road from the Malibu campus of Pepperdine. He is author of 2 Faces of Exclusion, The Untold History of Anti-Asian Racism in the United States, and also an earlier book, Japanese American Celebration and Conflict, A History of Ethnic Identity and Festival, 1934 to 1990. And that book was a winner of the History Book Award from the Association for Asian American Studies. He is editor also of Pacific America, Histories of Transoceanic Crossings, and co-editor of Conversations in Trans-Pacific History, a special edition of the journal Pacific History Historical Review. His article, Rethinking Anti-Immigrant Racism, Lesson from the Los Angeles Vote on the 1920 Alien Land Law, won the Carl Wheat Prize for Best Publication to appear in Southern California Quarterly between 2012 and 2014. So you can see quite quite a good deal of research about Asian American history, and they also his publication have also appeared in other journals such as the Journal of American History, a Pacific Historical Review, Reviews in American History, and others. Professor Kurashige is co-editor also of the textbook Major Problems in Asian American History, 2nd edition, just a few years ago. He is a founding author of the college-level textbook Global Americans, A History of the United States, also just a few years ago. He has received 2 Fulbright visiting lecturer fellowships to Japan, and also research awards from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rockefeller Foundation, and also from his own institution, USC. He has taught courses at the undergraduate as well as graduate levels on US history, American immigration and ethnicity, Asian American history, quantitative history, and California and the West. So you can see the scope of Professor Kurashige's research and teaching and experience. So please welcome to the Zoom podium, Dr. Lon Kurashige.
Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Jeff, for organizing, giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to the Pepperdine audience. Of course, we all wish we could be in Malibu today. It's a beautiful, almost summer day. But unfortunately, we're in the Zoom sphere right now. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I have about a 20-minute PowerPoint to give. And let me just start from the beginning. So the title of my talk is here, and I think you've all seen that. This comes from the idea of the talk of this lessons from the past comes from the last chapter, and I'll show you this in a second, of this, my latest single authored book called Faces of Exclusion. That's the one you see on the poster for this talk. But I want to start with the moment we're in, and I think we all kind of have a clear sense of the hate crimes happening as we speak against Asian and Pacific American Islander Americans throughout the country. And so here's a Time magazine from a few months ago, cover story about the killings in Atlanta that specifically targeted Asian women or Asian American women. And so I wanted to definitely, make this a talk that's timely, right? So I don't know if any of you have read this or subscribed to Time magazine or read this story, but I want to capture two of the paragraphs that really talk about the history of anti-Asian racism as it relates to today, because the bottom title on the cover, Confronting America's Legacy of Anti-Asian Violence by Katie Lang. This is the essential piece in terms of the history argument of that cover story. So let me have you read that if you can. I have two of these paragraphs, so I'll give you a few minutes to read the first. And for those of you who are fast readers, I will put the second on. So here you have from the author a very quick overview of anti-Asian racism, anti-Asian violence throughout the whole sort of span of US history, or at least from the 1850s till 1982 and the murder of Vincent Chin. And all of this, of course, is accurate and true. These things happened. But what I like to do, especially in my classes, is to sort of deconstruct and to think about these passages or these two paragraphs. And I wish we were live because I would have you raise your hand and I would give you a sense of, to get your feedback to this question. And that is, what impression do these paragraphs leave about the causes of anti-Asian violence? The causes of anti-Asian violence. Now, given that we're not live or that we can't, I can't see your faces or I can't see your hands, I have to sort of tell you what I think is mentioned about the causes. Well, first of all, nothing, right? Really, the impression that these paragraphs leave is that the racism was uncaused. It was given, it was natural, it was part of the landscape or the culture of American history. And while it's true that these racist incidents happen, and we need to be aware of them, very much so, I have a problem with that impression. I know it's just one article, and I know, it's not a book, it's not a course, etc. And it's really important, as I said, to identify the problem of anti-Asian violence historically. But I have a problem with it leaving the impression that it was uncaused, that it was somehow natural, because my job, and I'm sure Tuan would agree, our job as historians is to deconstruct, is to show how history is a construction, right? And so our job is to pull it apart and to analyze it and to deconstruct, how it is that racism happened, how it is that it happens at certain times and not at other times, at certain places and not other places. And so to look at history very much as this sort of challenge to understand, rather than just sort of assume racism is already there. And so I want to start with this problem of the challenge of understanding anti-Asian violence. And so why study history? So this is kind of what I'm saying. We're not so much interested in slogans, although slogans are really important. Stop AAPI Hate is a very prominent and important slogan out there to be aware of what's going on and what has happened throughout American history in terms of anti-Asian racism. But as I approach it as a scholar, it's more of a puzzle, right? Why do these things happen? Again, why do they happen where they do, when they do? What other factors are involved in constructing this history, these incidents of anti-Asian hate? Okay, so very quickly, these are the books that Tuan mentioned. So I'll talk specifically about the Two Faces of Exclusion one, my most recent monograph, but here's my past monograph, the Japanese American Celebration and Conflict, and then other books as well. And here's the table of contents for the book that I'll address today. And again, I can't go through very many of these chapters at all. If any, maybe Tuan and I can have a conversation about it. But what I'll focus on is really, I'll get to the conclusion. First, I'll set it up by talking about a key figure in this book, in this narrative of this book, and then I'll talk about why, the lessons learned from his experience in terms of anti-Asian racism. So it'll kind of be a brief summary of the book through this one guy, Chester H. Rowell. Now, again, if we were in an audience, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've heard about Chester H. Rowell. He's a very prominent Californian. Well, I should say he was a very prominent Californian in the early 20th century, all the way up till he dies in 1948. He was very well known as, first of all, especially for those of us who study anti-Asian racism, as what one historian called the archetypical anti-Japanese racist. And this was in the early 20th century when the Japanese first started coming to the US. They came to Hawaii first, but soon afterwards, they jumped from Hawaii and started coming to California. And Rowell was in Fresno at the time in California. And he is saying, beware, Californians, there is this migration of Japanese coming in and they should be shut out. They should not be allowed into the country because it will create all sorts of problems for California and then the rest of the nation. And we'll go into what he meant by that, because it wasn't so obvious. Many people thought it was obvious, scholars in retrospect, and even at the time, and that's why they labeled him an anti-Japanese racist. He was a very prominent person at the time. He was in Fresno as the editor and the publisher of a well-known newspaper at the time, the Fresno Republican. Later on, it gets merged with the Sacramento Bee, and it becomes part of that McClatchy publishing house. But early on, it was independent. And it was important because it was the most prominent progressive newspaper in California of the day. And by progressive, I mean capital P. Not progressive just in the sense of it was forward thinking, but capital P in terms of progressive party. So at the time, you may have remembered your history classes, there was what was going on, what was called the progressive movement. And within the progressive movement very quickly was this major political and social reform movement going on that in essence sought to tame and humanize uncontrolled, unrestricted capitalism. So it sought to provide more benefits for workers, or more sort of, at least to acknowledge that workers have a right to exist, right? To have any kind of control over the workplace, and they're not just objects at the whim of the large capitalists, the robber barons. It had to do with restricting the big corporations in terms of their prices, in terms of their bigness, their size, in terms of their effect on the environment, etc. So in some ways, the welfare state as we know it today began in the progressive era. And so he's a founder. He brings progressive politics to California. He's also an internationalist. And this is after World War I, which is America gets involved in 1917 and it's over by 1918. It's the worst war ever that anyone has ever seen around the world, including the Americans. You know, many, many people die, you know, hundreds of thousands of people die. And these terrible deaths, these new technologies of gas, warfare, et cetera, we would call them weapons of mass destruction today. So after World War II, or in the wake of World War II, there's this big internationalist movement based on the League of Nations, which Woodrow Wilson insists upon and helps found, you know, after World War II. Of course, America doesn't join. That's a whole nother story. But there's a big internationalist fervor in the U.S. as around the world, and Raoul is part of that. And specifically, he's involved in this Institute of Pacific Relations, which is about all the countries that border or have colonies in the Pacific. And the main two countries who were involved in this organization and people were concerned about in terms of the Pacific, in terms of war, was Japan and the US. And so Raoul's main purpose in joining and being a publisher for this, or a publicist of this organization, was to lessen the temperature, lower the possibility of war between the US and Japan. So he was an internationalist, especially in terms of US-Japan relations. In the 30s, late 20s and 30s, around this time, he becomes editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. So he moves, he sells the Republican in the early 20s to the Bee and the McClatchy corporations. And then later on, he becomes editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. And when World War II starts, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, he's still the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. And let me get to that in a second. He opposes the internment of Japanese Americans. He is one of the few major voices out there in mainstream newspapers or any kind of journalism to oppose the internment of Japanese Americans. Many other prominent columnists were actively supporting it. He's also a general backer of civil rights for African Americans, especially in California and throughout the nation. And so then let me get to this other former supporter of Reconstruction. So part of his concerns about civil rights, whether it's for Japanese Americans or whether it's for African Americans or any other groups, comes from his longtime support for civil rights after the Civil War. Now, he's not born, I mean, he's born just after the Civil War during Reconstruction in 1867. But as a young adult, he supports the Reconstruction of the South, civil rights for African Americans, as the clerk of his father's House committee in Washington, D.C. His father's a congressman from Illinois, and Raoul goes to serve and to help him in this committee to rule out fraudulent elections. He would get a lot of work today in terms of a House committee on fraudulent elections. But this was specifically designed to prevent the kinds of chicanery, the kinds of discrimination that African American voters were facing in the South at the time. Okay, so now the lessons from Asian American history regarding Raoul, specifically as through Raoul. So the first lesson I learned from writing this book and doing a lot of research on anti-Asian racism, that included not just Raoul, of course, is that racism isn't the only story when it comes to anti-Asian racism. It seems like, well, that seems to be like not make sense. But in fact, my argument is that it wasn't just about the racism against Asians, but it was about the opposition to the racism, that just as many people opposed the racism as they did support it. Now, when I say just as many people, I don't mean throughout the nation. My book focuses on legislative debates around exclusion, immigration exclusion, around, especially, but around other forms of discrimination that were legal, that were passed through the US Congress. And so the story is about how in Congress from the 1850s till around the 1950s, for about 100 years, there's always a debate. And it wasn't just a one-sided story of discrimination. So one of the questions I answer regarding this is, why did exclusion take so long? So the first Chinese start coming in the 1850s for the gold rush in California, right, to dig for gold, and then to do other types of mining, et cetera, railroad building. But they weren't excluded until 1882 by Congress. So it took 30 years, a whole generation, for them to be excluded. So if it was only about racism and discrimination, it would have happened right away. And so the story is more complicated because the opposition to racism was dominant in Congress from the 1850s to the 1880s. And so it's a story of why were they dominant, but also how did they lose power to the exclusionists. Okay, the second lesson I learned from this study was that racism against Asians is part of a larger story of US history. You can't just focus it narrowly, frame it narrowly. I mean, you can. If you focus it narrowly just on what happens to Asian Americans and how they're victimized, you get one story. But if you focus it broadly and you see all of the influences upon, this is the puzzle I was talking about, the challenge of doing history, seeing all the other influences upon this story, then the story looks different. The racism is still there, the acts are still there, they're the same, but the meanings of it, the causes of it become much more complicated, and the picture becomes much more diverse and difficult to understand. Another lesson I learned, the third lesson I learned, was that when you focus just on the racism or on the anti-racism that I talked about, the opposition, you get a certain picture of the past. Now, typically, I bring up this notion of losers' history. That's not a common term. We typically, when we think about, the past, we're much more familiar with the term winners' history, right? I think it's Winston Churchill is seen as sort of the originator of that phrase, winners' history. The way we look at the past is always through the lens of who won. Right? Who won? Who gets to write the history? There's an Orwellian nature to this as well. Who gets to write the history are the winners, right? They get to write the history and put it in the history books and make it official and have all the students memorize it, etc. Okay, so we all understand winners' history and how that clouds the view of the past. But what is losers' history? My argument is that really since the civil rights movement, what we were learning oftentimes in textbooks and in history classes and in history documentaries, etc., is the perspective of the victims, whether they're Holocaust victims, whether they're victims of civil rights violations and hate crimes, etc. We learn a lot about this loser's history, and that's a good. I don't think that's a good thing that we can see it both ways, both the winner side and the loser side. My point is not that losers' history is bad, not at all, but that losers' history is incomplete and that provides a certain view of the past. And so, for example, for the study of anti-Asian racism in history, the loser's perspective has been, like the Time magazine cover story, that racism has just been a natural part of the US environment, of the US political environment, and we don't really need to see the complexities of this. And also, the key point of that one is that in not understanding the complexities of anti-Asian racism, we rule out the possibility and the fact, really, of the opposition to it. So again, most scholars, when they view the history of anti-Asian racism, only see the racism. And they study the racism, and they study it very well. I mean, because they're historians and they're scholars, they study it in a very complex way, unlike the Time magazine story, because they have a different purpose. But they rule out and they don't see the debate. They don't see the opposition to this in Congress or throughout society. So the loser's history prevents what I call clouded or kind of an opaque view of the past that that denies this debate that I think is really important about these discriminatory policies. Okay, two more very quickly. Points that I raised, lessons I learned was racism reveals becoming a Pacific nation, reveals America becoming a Pacific nation. And so the question I raised, if US was so racist against Asians, why did they come to stay? And so this is a larger point about how the US, at least since the 1850s, if not earlier, has seen itself as not just looking to Europe and the Atlantic, but seen its future as across the Pacific. Right? So it's no coincidence that most of our wars in the 20th century have been in Asia, whether it's Japan or Korea or Vietnam, right? Because the US has always seen itself, at least its future destiny, as that of a Pacific nation. So the Atlantic is the old world, that's our past, but the future is Asia. And so it's not surprising again, too, that China is our biggest trade partner today, because Americans saw that since the 1850s. They've been talking about it. Right, so this whole history of anti-Asian racism reveals this whole process of becoming a Pacific nation. And finally, and we'll get into this, perhaps Tuan and I will get into it, or the questions will get into it, racism sheds light on today's problems, right? To think about the past racism against Asian Americans as a link between what's going on today in terms of AAPI hate crimes. And we can have a long discussion about this because it's very complicated, and to me, it's very important and interesting. So I will stop there, and I will let Tuan take over in terms of his questions.
Thank you so much, Lon. And please, I wish to invite the audience once again. Feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat anytime, and I will be happy to read them out loud. First of all, I really enjoy reading your book. I read it maybe a little quickly over the weekend, but and there's a lot I think I can say about it, and I'll ask you about it. But if I may, pick up on your notion, right, of the loser history. Perhaps another way of putting it, right, that in a way we can say, there is no inevitability in history. Things could go right another way had it been for certain circumstances and so on and so forth, right? And so, so my first question, Ilan, is, would you expound on that notion? Because if there is a loser side, it doesn't mean that the losers would necessarily lose. So in your long, and I do want to say to the audience that it is a long history, divided into specific chapters and so on. But but overall, how would you characterize at least the initial period? I can describe in your first chapter about that things could have gone the way of those who were opposing exclusion. So let's begin with that.
Yeah, and thank you, Tuan, because I think that the first chapter of my book is really important. This is a period between the 1850s to the 1880s. And this is a period that I briefly mentioned was marked, at least in the US Congress, by the opposition to anti-Asian racism. Because ever since the Chinese first started coming in the 1850s, people in California, politicians in California, were rallying for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants for all of the reasons that would come to be the rationale in the 1882 exclusion when it actually happens. That they're not white, right? They can't become good Americans. There's all sorts of other factors. Disease, and this is something that we know about today, right? The sphere of disease. They bring these communicable diseases. They have weird cultures and habits, and they're not Christian, right? They're heathens. All of these other factors all come in. But a lot of it had to do with, they're taking money away from us and jobs away from us being the sort of white Americans. That was California. Washington, D.C. was totally different. In California, we were from California. We have a certain pride in California. We like to think that we were major players in the 1850s. We were nothing in terms of Congress. Like, we had 1 or 2 representatives, we were not involved at all. in terms of what's going on in terms of passing legislation. No one really cared about California. What was dominant in California at the time, 1850s, was parties. First it was the Whig Party, and then after the Civil War began, it became the Republican Party, or even just before the Civil War began, that was very much interested in Pacific trade, that was very much interested in getting to China. That was the main thing, because China was seen, as I mentioned before, as this sort of, it's the same idea today. If we can sell one of our products, whether it's toothbrushes or whatever, tractors in China, we would be super rich. And America was very concerned about its economy, in its competition with the Great Britain for being the dominant economic power of the world. We were way behind in 1850, way behind. Great Britain was just way, the superpower. If there was one superpower, it was Great Britain. We were not even second or third. So not offending the Chinese government was number one on the priority, and in order to get at the China market. And so that was dominant. And it's not such a simple picture as that, but that idea was really dominant in Congress up until 1882. And so that changes, and what's key to that change is not just the Civil War ends, but Reconstruction ends. And so this massive effort occupying the South militarily to transform it in terms of civil rights, to give African Americans or the former free men and women equal rights. It was only done at the bayonet. It's only done because the Northern troops were there. Let's kind of think about Iraq. The changes are only happening, and there was a lot of opposition to it, just like in Iraq. A lot of, that was the KKK and other sort of, paramilitary organizations fighting and killing people. So once that ends, and that ends, by the 1880s, that ends 1878. There's an important election. Once that ends, that changes the whole sort of political calculus, where Republicans are no longer the single party dominant in power. The Democrats come back into power, and with that balance of power completely ends that sort of focus on China, or that attempt to woo China. And the Republicans still like it, but even they start kind of bailing on that idea. So that's one example of the historical conditions that can change, that didn't mean it was going to be one way or the other. I like to see this debate between the racist and the opposition to them as a kind of like a basketball game, where there's momentum on one side and one side is winning, but doesn't mean the other side is completely losing. It's a close game and they're going back and forth. But the momentum shifts by 1882. And that's when the exclusionist policies become prevalent and dominant for another 100 years or so.
And one could say the game may go over time sometimes.
Yeah,
right. It could have. I mean, hence it took 3 decades to really came to a sort of a.
Yeah, not 100 years, but it's at least 60 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if I may introduce something that I think is central to the book that, for the sake of brevity, Lon hasn't mentioned yet, but it is really conceptually crucial to understand, his point, I think, is your conceptualization of 2 groups, right? The exclusionists, whose story are generally well known. And then on the other hand, you have referenced them here and there, but you call them the egalitarians. And for me, it is definitely one of the highlights of the book to learn about them, and some of the names, may be familiar, to historians, and yet, I think one of the values of the book is to dig in and, like locating the arguments. So, would you explain to, to the audience here a little bit more, who exactly were these egalitarians? And we can constrain it to the 19th century, but obviously they are egalitarians later on as well. So let's begin with that. And if I may point out one thing, not just exclusionists, right, and egalitarians, but also Western exclusionists on the one hand, including people from California who were opposed, right, to who were advocating exclusion, and then Eastern egalitarians. So I just want to point that out for the audience to make even a finer distinction.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the egalitarians basically are the people I'm talking about who oppose discriminatory policies. So that's the name I give to them. And I think that's the kind of novel feature of the story of the book that I wrote, is to add them. And that's what makes it a debate, because normally they're not in that story. It's just about the exclusionists and the racists. So when you add them and they're in a significant way, then it becomes this, we call it the basketball game, or we call it the debate, whatever it is, but it becomes a different story. So my short answer to who are the egalitarians, whether it's 19th or 20th century, is they're diverse, right? The only thing they really have in common is they oppose discrimination against Asian immigrants. And they do it for all sorts of reasons, right? And so big businessmen who are building the Central Pacific Railroad from California out east, right? They're doing it because they need labor. So Leland Stanford and Crocker and others who are Huntington, all of those people, they don't want to exclude Chinese labor, right? For their own economic reasons, but they have other rationales as well. For China as a great civilization, we shouldn't discriminate against them, etc. Other people like missionaries, former missionaries in China or current missionaries in China have a biblical reason, or they have a religious reason, right? We are all brothers, right? We're all children of God, etc. There's no reason to discriminate based on race. There's no basis of race because we're all God's children, etc. And they advocate for the Chinese because they know them really well. They're oftentimes fluent. They've lived in China. And so they have a kind of human rights understanding. In addition to a religious rationale, they're kind of the prototypical sort of human rights advocates in some ways. You have civil rights people who are pro, African American, who want to grant them equal rights. They want to be consistent, and they see the same thing for the Chinese. Frederick Douglass would be one of these types of people in the 19th century. You have people like Chester Rao, who don't want war between the US and Japan, who are internationalists who want peace. And so if the price of peace means ending exclusion or not having exclusion, that's a small price to pay for millions of people dying, which is actually what happens, right, in World War II. So that's just a sample of many different people who are egalitarian.
Mm-hmm. No, it sounds, listening to you, I feel, as if they were, similar to, say, the anti-imperialists, in the makeup, various right groups, various issues, and so on. Was there, to continue with that subject, were there any, aside from wanting to opposing exclusion, was there any threat, specifically that tied them or most of them together, aside from their basic opposition?
No, I think that's my point. I think there are communities that are tied together for other, whether it's civil rights or whether it's internationalism and stuff like that. But they are a loose coalition.
So do you think that's why, they, eventually, that, so to speak, they ended up on the loser side? I mean, in the 20th century, which we can get into later, the story changes, which is good, right? But in the 19th century, in a way, it was too loose of a coalition to really...
I don't know, because I would make the same point about the exclusionists.
Okay.
On that side, that they were also strange bedfellows, many of them, even though they used a lot of the same rhetoric of this is a white nation, etc. They had very different rationales for it. Some for labor purposes, we want to make labor unions become more powerful, and this is a sign, even though the Chinese and the Asians and Japanese and Filipinos are such a small percentage of the labor force, even in California, and they're not competing in the same jobs. This is an argument you hear still today, right? It was about kind of legitimacy. This is where we're hanging our hat, staking our claim, and we want to win this one, because it's not about today, it's about in the future. if we give the corporations this power to be able to bring in this industrial reserve army of Asian workers, we lose, right? If we grant them that ability, even if they're not there at this time, in the future, if they can do that, we lose. And so labor is definitely one of them. You know, there are the racists in the South, right, and in the West and all over the country who really believe this notion of a white nation. You know, we see their legacy today in many ways in the Trump movement. They have their own sort of racial purity arguments and rationales, and they're less concerned. They're not labor activists, you know, or they're not, you know, concerned at all about any of that. In fact, they're not progressive in that sense at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are just two examples. There's lots of other factors, you know, that we'll go into. And Chester Roll is an interesting person in this regard too, because he's not racist in this way of like the Southerners, you know, the KKK types, not at all. He opposed that type, as I said. He wanted to stop Japanese immigration because he said, if we can turn back the time and not allow slavery, African slavery that happened in the South, we should do that. Because look, white people in the South will never accept them. Look at what happens with the failure. He gets disillusioned with the failure of Reconstruction. And he says, I wish we never had this racial problem. So when he moves to California, he says, white people will never be tolerant, will never be able to accept a non-white group like the Japanese. So let's nip it in the bud. They're just starting to come over. So he wasn't racist saying he could accept the Japanese. He loved Japan. He loved the Japanese, like Teddy Roosevelt, etc. But he said the vast majority of white people in California and the nation cannot. And so why not stop all the racial problems while it's small? Nip it in the bud. That was his argument. So basically, he makes the point that racial problems are a white problem. It's the white people who can't handle it. And therefore, we should try to prevent that as much as possible.
Thank you. I do see one question in the chat, and please, you know, our audience, please feel free to type up any more questions. But let's get to the question, because I thought this is, you know, a broader question here. Do you think anti-Asian racism is unique? A big question.
Unique in what sense? Unique as opposed to anti-Black racism? But again, we can't interact very freely, and so I have to kind of, let me play out both sides. Is it any different than anti-Black racism? Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. In terms of the rhetoric, oftentimes when you think about the 19th century or the 20th century, it was the same arguments being used, you know, by Southerners or by Northerners and Westerners, you know, later on in terms of scientific racism. You know, there is a kind of genetic hierarchy, and that you would cause what Theodore Roosevelt termed race suicide if you have all these Asian people come in and start marrying with white people, right? That would be mongrelization. That would be bad for our genetic gene pool, our American gene pool, which is Anglo-Saxon, which at the time was seen as superior because it was Anglo-Saxon. Now the Mediterraneans, the Italians, and the Eastern Europeans, Slavs, etc., were seen as inferior to the Anglo-Saxon, but that's a whole nother story. So in that sense, there are a lot of similarities between how Blacks were treated and how Asians were treated, and how other non-white groups, whether it's Native Americans or, you know, Latinos or Middle Easterners, etc. There was a lot of sort of anyone who was not the Anglo-Saxon purity. And religion has something to do with it, who weren't the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because then you have Catholics, you have Irish, you have Germans, you have other Catholics, you know, later on the Italians and etc., who were discriminated against because of religion, right? And there was this racial genetic thing about they're Mediterranean or whatever, they're not Anglo-Saxon. So in that sense, it's similar, but it's different too, right? Because throughout the 19th century until 1952, really, Blacks could become citizens. And even though voting was incredibly constrained in the South and discriminatory, they could vote in the North. they could vote. There was no legal limitation on their voting. There was all sorts of extra legal, or maybe, maybe it was legal in the South, but we know that, that was not morally right. But for Asians, they couldn't become citizens. Asian immigrants couldn't become citizens until 1952. 1952. So that's like 100 years of their experience in the US. They couldn't become citizens. So it's a very different way that they had to respond, right, to the kinds of discrimination they faced. But then, of course, this is the elephant in the room. Also, Asians didn't come as slaves, right? And that's a whole nother difference when it comes to African Americans. So is anti-Asian racism unique? Is it similar or different from anti-Black racism? It's a very complicated question.
Thank you. No, it is indeed. It is indeed. If I may go back to the book on a couple of things, and moving into the 20th century, I really enjoy reading, the chapters, but specifically the one about the Filipinos, in the 1920s, right? When, where you discusses in that chapter about what you call the final exclusion. Right, and this is a turning point in some respects here. Would you share with us what you think to be, unique about the Filipino situation in terms of exclusion and egalitarianism?
Yeah, thank you, Chuan, because the Filipino experience is quite different from and similar from the experience of the Chinese and then the Japanese, because the Philippines were our colony. We're a US colony, so 1899, and we didn't give it up until 1933, but even then it was conditional giving up, and they don't really gain their freedom until after World War II. So as colonial subjects, there was a tradition that American government upheld of allowing the colonial subjects, in this case the Filipinos, to be able to migrate to the metropole, to the homeland being America, in this case, the colonial homeland. And so they were allowed to migrate to the US even after the Chinese and the Japanese and all other Asians were excluded in 1924. And so the US government had to, if they wanted to exclude the Filipinos, like they did all the other Asian immigrant groups after 1924, they had to come up with special legislation. In order to come up with, in order to come up with that special legislation, they had to, in the end, free the Philippines, grant independence for the Philippines. And they did it conditionally. So they said in 1933, we have this Filipino Independence Act, but we're going to put you on a 10-year timetable. So all of our economic ties, all of our political ties won't end until 10 years. But when it comes to immigration, that ends immediately. So in some ways, the independence was wrapped up in, or the other way around, the exclusion of Filipinos was wrapped up in the independence of the Philippines. So the process in which it happened, the result was the same, but the rationales were the same, roughly. But the process in which it happened was very different because of the colonial relationship.
I mean, in a way, right, we like that is a moment when we see a weakening of the exclusionist side, I suppose, right? And so that's another thing that I really enjoy about your book, right? The connection between international relations that play a direct role, right? And both sides. The exclusionists as well as the egalitarians, both sides may appeal to international relations and so on. So in a way, the story is more complex now than just Western exclusionists and so on.
Let me add one thing about the Filipino story, which I think is really important. Filipinos are the first Asians to be able to argue in Congress on their behalf against the discrimination. Because as colonial subjects, they are just like when they were a colony, the Philippines were a colony, they had non-voting representatives in Congress, just like Washington, D.C. does, just like Puerto Rico does today. And so it was those non-voting, they're delegates, basically, and they were major figures in the Philippines, were able to argue on the House floor, and especially in committee meetings, on behalf of non-discriminatory legislation, don't discriminate against Filipinos based on race, etc., on behalf of independence, etc. And there's a whole contingent of people, of major leaders, legislative leaders in the Philippines who came over to the House and to the Senate and argued on their behalf. And they can do this because basically they're part of the US government as the Filipino national representatives. So I find that's a turning point because before that time, Asian Americans had no real legal standing, no political standing. They couldn't vote. They weren't citizens, right? And the second generation, the American-born generation, was way too young, too few.
Yeah, I think we do have a question in the chat, and I think that you might have partially answered that one. The question is, are there examples to you that stand out of Asians and Asian Americans who spoke out against racism and exclusion, and perhaps discuss more of that entailed in history, in speeches, newspaper articles, opinion pieces, etc. And now we can say Congress as well. Anything would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that the Filipino representatives were just the first, and this was in the 1930s, late 20s, early 1930s. But since then, and even after that, during World War II and later on, you had American-born Asians who were American citizens. And then later on, once immigrants become citizens, right, who really start speaking up and taking over. But they don't. What really helps them is the war. And it's Japanese American veterans, the ones who are part of many of the units the fighting battalion that died disproportionately in Europe, fighting for the American government. They had a certain amount of stature that coming from blood that the whole battalion spilled. And because the US won, was victorious, right? And so they start having more say. There's a Japanese American named Mike Masaoka, who's part of that unit, who's fighting the civil rights campaign for Japanese Americans and really other Asian Americans. But the turning point was Hawaii. When Hawaii becomes a state, in 1960, then the Asian American politicians from Hawaii, many of whom are from this battalion, this Japanese American battalion, come to DC as Congress people and then as senators. So Danny Noe is a good example of that, who lost an arm in that battalion, and have much more clout and much more say on Capitol Hill.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions here. Let me just read them, even though they are somewhat different. Let me just read them together so you can choose to answer which one first. Does your book include racism against South Asians? And if so, how does that differ from the other kinds of racism against Asians? And then how would you explain anti-Asian racism from other people of color? People other than white people being racist against Asian Americans. So two different questions. Yeah.
So two different questions. So I'll take two different. Let me start with the South Asian question. So yes, I mean, it's not a large chapter in my book on South Asians because they weren't a large migration. The large migrations, and when we're talking large, we're talking minuscule compared to Italians and Jews and others who came around the same time. Or for the Chinese who came earlier compared to Irish and Germans, much smaller fractions because they were excluded. By the time it really started going, there were exclusions that limited very much the Asian migrations. But in terms of Asian Americans, the largest migrations were first the Chinese, then the Japanese, and then the Filipinos. Indians come around the same time, as well as Koreans come around the same time as the Japanese. But when Japan colonizes Korea, they cut off the Korean migration. So we're talking thousands of people, like maybe 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 at the most were Koreans. And for South Asians, the British government, because it's still a colony, India is still a colony, still the Raj in India, they cut off the migration of the British as well. And so yes, they're in the study, but especially the South Asians are in there around World War I, when there's an Immigration Act, that's when the US government, in cooperation with the British government, cut off Indian immigration, as well as all Asian immigrations, with the exception of the Philippines. So it really starts around 1918 with the Immigration Act of 1918. Now, the exceptions are Filipinos, and the exceptions were the Japanese. So the Japanese get excluded in 24. So the other question, remind me, Tuan, what was the other question now?
How would you explain anti-Asian racism from
from other people of color?
So intra-racial.
Yeah, it's first I would say it's real. It's a long history of what would you call it, intra-racial or people of color, racism against each other. One, because we're all susceptible to stereotypes and fears. After Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed successfully Pearl Harbor, a number, not a lot, but a handful of Japanese Americans in California were killed as a kind of revenge murder, like we know what happens after 9/11 when a Sikh man gets killed, right? Because they think he's Muslim or he's part of somehow the conspiracy, which of course he wasn't. The killers were mostly Filipino. So there's no love lost, because at the same time as the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, they're bombing the Philippines. They're taking over the Philippines from the Americans. They kick out Douglas MacArthur, right? And they're bombing through. Of course, they're already at war in China, and there's they're and the whole rape of Nanking and the whole kind of brutality. And then they've been colonial masters and lords of Korea. So in terms of other Asians, there's no love loss. There's no natural affinity among them between African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and Asians. I would say it's more common to have fractions and divisions among those groups and stereotypes, and in terms of how they see each other, than it is to have commonality and solidarity. You have that. You have commonality and solidarity, but you also have a lot of differences. So it's not. You can't make the assumption just because someone's African American and they're mistreated and discriminated against, they're going to be side with, say, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, or Japanese Americans. That we're talking historically in the 19th century and the early 20th century. In that sense, they would be more like the everyday, like the average white person at the time. There's not a lot of evidence of a huge amount of maybe individuals, leaders, charismatic figures who are united, but not a whole lot of evidence that the masses are united.
Yeah, okay. We have a couple of minutes left, and and I'm going to call on Jeff to post the link to the to a chance to get an autographed an autograph, a book from our author today. My last question is Lon, were there any surprises, big surprises that you found out in the course of your research? I know that you spent a long time on this book. You mentioned your son was young, when you began the project, and then they were going off to college or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah, so I'm just curious.
Well, I would say it would be just Chester Rao. I just saw him as this racist figure, and that he turned and he changed and became this advocate for civil rights for Asian Americans, for Japanese Americans in particular. That surprised me. So it's not just Rao, but it's about all the other people like him, that whole egalitarian side. That was the surprise.
Okay. And yes, I just posted the link. Feel free, please register to win one of two autographed copies of the book. We are reaching the end of the hour. And I just wish to thank Lon for this wonderful conversation. I know that I enjoy reading the book, and I'm sure I will be reading it again, or at least some chapters again, and probably assign in my classes in the future. And I encourage our audience to seek it out as well. I did know, if I may mention, I did know that, if you are a Pepperdine faculty or staff or student, you should be able to get it, the PDF version on JSTOR. Pepperdine, so just to let people know that it is available in a certain form at Pepperdine University.
Great. Well, thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Pepperdine community. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you again. Everybody, thanks for coming. Have a good afternoon and a good evening. Bye-bye now.